It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here at this book launch. I really do believe that the book that is being launched is a seminal book, not just for Asia, but for the thinking about infrastructure in the world. And what it does is it fills a very important gap in two ways. First of all, many of us make some of the assertions that you heard in the book, but we do it on the basis of faith and belief. And what the report does is really provide strong quantitative evidence about the impacts that we see around not just the growth impacts of infrastructure, but the broader development impacts of infrastructure. Second, it provides insights on financing that are really truly important, and that is that if you just looked at infrastructure projects and you think about financing them on the back of user charges, you will have very little by the way of infrastructure. Essentially because infrastructure is built around spillovers. And I think what the book does is it lays the basis for what I would call a new public-private partnership around, in some sense, recognition that producing infrastructure is truly a public good and the public sector has to lead, but the private sector has the capacity to deliver, but it needs a new form of partnership where the public sector has to make the investment whole. And we heard very eloquently from Secretary Mark Villar how, in some sense, the public sector can lead, and the case of Philippines that I heard today was truly inspirational. So there is not much point in my repeating the excellence of the book since I agree with it. I will elaborate on some of the points, I do not have comparative advantage of the country case, which we heard so excellently from Mark Villar. So what I will do is I will place this book in the larger debate and discussions about infrastructure at this point in time, and why the next 20 years are more important in the issues of infrastructure than they have been perhaps for the previous history. And so let me begin a little bit with these 3 points. One is that we have a new global agenda. Mark Villar talked about it as the 2030 agenda. And infrastructure is central to that agenda. The second I want to focus on are the drivers of quality infrastructure. What drives infrastructure? What are the things that we have learned? And finally, I want to spend some time on meeting the financing challenge. So, as we've heard from the book, infrastructure is key for driving economic growth. But in the global context right now, where we are with aging populations, with the threat of secular stagnation, with in some sense also productivity declines in both advanced and emerging markets, the role of infrastructure in reigniting growth is extremely important. Second, as we heard from Secretary Villar, and I will elaborate on that, infrastructure is key if we are to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, although we haven't spoken about it, it has been mentioned, and I will elaborate on it, is it is absolutely key to driving strong climate action. And delivering on sustainable infrastructure is at the center of all of these 3 challenges. And well-designed infrastructure can be pro-growth, it can be pro-poor, and it can be pro-climate. So why is infrastructure so central to growth? Because it boosts, in some sense, demand in the economy at a time. It is domestically oriented demand. So at a time when we are talking about trade wars, infrastructure doesn't lead to trade wars. It actually boosts domestic demand. Second, it is a great, of course, impetus to productivity growth through the channels that Dr. Yoshino set out so clearly. It spurs innovation, and particularly today when we are at the advent of disruptive technological change, it will disrupt infrastructure, but infrastructure will also help create a more technologically friendly base for making other capital stock more productive. And it is the only feasible long-term basis, because any other path is actually going to lead to, in some sense, ruin. In particular, the infrastructure of the past cannot be the infrastructure of the future. That is a very important point to be recognized. So here's the story around the sustainable development goals, and if you organize them, you will see that sustainable infrastructure or quality infrastructure basically supports it in three ways. It supports it by boosting growth, so several SDGs that are related to inclusive growth are really supported by infrastructure. It enhances access to basic services, and of course it protects environment sustainability. And what the book does is it demonstrates these linkages, and it demonstrates in concrete country cases, as we see for the Philippines example of education, that this is actually a joint product that comes out of infrastructure. The other thing that I think is worth emphasizing from the book is this theme of spillovers and externalities. So the book showed that there is economic impact beyond direct users and beyond project, and as was pointed out by Secretary Villard, there is innovative approaches by measuring, in some sense, household incomes, tax revenues, GDP, and the distribution and control versus, in some sense, the targeted areas, to show that these benefits actually happen, and that these benefits, in some sense, are quantified relative to the direct benefits. Second, we do get a development impact through access to opportunities and through access to services. But there is an important point here for emerging markets and developing countries, and that is the importance of affordability of services. If the services are too expensive, then in some sense they will fail their development impact. I often point out that in Asia, we can now deliver power for 4-6 cents a kilowatt hour. In Africa, that same power is delivered at 20-30 cents a kilowatt hour, which completely detracts from its development impact. So for infrastructure is very good economically, but it will not produce double-digit rates of return financially. And that's a very important element to keep in mind about, in some sense, making infrastructure whole and infrastructure financing complete. The third implication about infrastructure is it is a great instrument, of course, for national and regional integration. The whole integration of Western China into the Chinese economy was built around not infrastructure as responding to growth, but infrastructure leading to growth. It's a very different kind of way of thinking about infrastructure, and the result in China, I would argue, on the whole, has been very positive, skeptics notwithstanding. So it has been, in some sense, an engine of growth and inclusion, particularly in bringing in disadvantaged people, disadvantaged populations into the growth integration. And the final point about infrastructure is it is about intergenerational equity. We don't build infrastructure just for the current generation. We build it for future generations. And we have to remember when we build infrastructure that tomorrow's users will be more numerous and richer than today's users. Okay? So we know that when we build a road, 20 years, 30 years down the road, a path, there will be more users, and they are going to be a lot richer than today's users. And therefore, it's extremely important to take that into account when we think about the burdens and the financing structures around infrastructure. The second part, again, the book makes a very, very important contribution is the recognition of spillovers at the regional and indeed at the global level, and that connectivity is a foundation for getting externalities and spillovers at scale beyond the national level, and building that out sensibly is going to be very important. And particularly in this region, the Belt and Road Initiative is one very, very big enterprise. If gotten right, it can be, I often say, the Belt and Road Initiative to Asia is what Rome was to Europe. It's going to set patterns of connectivity that will last for not just centuries, but probably forever, as we find in the case of Europe. So getting it right is very important. If we get it wrong, we will lock ourselves into very bad patterns of connectivity. And the last part is environment and global commons, because infrastructure accounts for roughly the build and use of infrastructure accounts for roughly 60% of global emissions in a flow sense. And another way to think about it is, if you look at the stock of infrastructure today and you say how much of the carbon budget will be used up by the current stock of infrastructure, the answer is 100%. And we know that in the next 20 years, we are going to double the stock of infrastructure. So the relationship between infrastructure and climate is absolutely, absolutely central. So I won't spend time. I want to pace this a little so I can cover the ground. So we know that Paris was really a very, very significant agreement. Why? Because in it for the first time was a recognition of the problem. In it for the first time was a commitment to addressing it. And in it for the first time was a recognition this is not a horse race, and this is not about us and them. It's about all of us being in the same boat. And if we sink, we all sink together. And if we float, it's only because we all acted together. Now, I know the US is a little bit out of sync on this story, but the reality is that in the G20 and even today, everybody else, fortunately, is still on the boat and rowing quite strongly. Now, here is the challenge that we face with regard to the climate. If you take the pledges that were made in Paris in terms of what we call the NDC commitments, they are much better than before. And you see that in terms of the top line is the baseline. The current policy pledges, as you can see, marks a clear inflection down. But compared to where we need to be, we are still very, very far away. We have to be able to turn this, and we have to be able to do it very, very quickly. Just take energy as an example. So energy consumption, we know, varies tremendously across in per capita terms. United States, in Saudi Arabia, in 290 range. China is 93 per capita, and India is 28. And one very important implication is there is no way that emerging markets and developing countries can follow the path of the old. The good news is that technology is changing very, very rapidly to allow us to have a better energy future. But those investments are not always being made. We are still building too many coal-fired power plants around the world, including and especially, I would say, here in this region. But the possibilities now of renewable energy are truly transformative and could make a huge difference, not only in terms of reducing costs, but in terms of access, for example, through distributed power. I want to focus a little bit on the scale of the investments that are needed. And the scale of the investments, we all talk about trillions, and, it's very difficult to conceptualize trillions. So one number that we came up with, and this is detailed numbers that we did about estimating investment needs between 2015 and 2030, is roughly the world will have to spend something like about 90 trillion, 80 to 90 trillion between now and 2030 in terms of infrastructure. And 2 points I want to make come out of it. One is that emerging markets and developing countries will account for 60 to 70% of that spend. I'll give you a very powerful number. China spends more on infrastructure than all other developing and emerging markets put together. You won't be maybe surprised by that, but China spends more than all the developed countries put together. So the spend in China on infrastructure is tremendous part of what you see in the global scene, and China now invests more in infrastructure in the rest of the world than all advanced countries, the World Bank, and all multilateral development banks put together. And Japan is the other leader in the infrastructure space. So in infrastructure, we are having massive changes, not only in terms of demand, but also in the provision and the cooperation around infrastructure that will have tremendous implications going forward. So I want to end with saying that we have tremendous urgency, but there are also tremendous opportunities. Because of, there are three numbers I will leave you. In the next 15 years, the total capital stock in infrastructure will likely double. In the next 20 years, the world economy will likely double. And in the next 30 years, the urban population will likely double. These are massive once-in-a-history transformations that the world has to get right, and that's why it's so important to focus on infrastructure. Having said that, despite this importance, I would say that in the aggregate level, we are not meeting the scale of the investments required, and significant proportions of the investments that are being made do not meet the tests of quality or sustainability. And the reason for it is twofold. There are two gaps. On the one hand, in advanced as well as in emerging markets and developing countries, we are not able to translate the tremendous opportunities and the tremendous needs into realized demands, into concrete viable projects. And on the other hand, while we all say there are 100 trillion in terms of private savings, we are not able to mobilize the right finance, right time, right cost in order to finance infrastructure. And building this bridge is what it is needed in terms of getting the infrastructure story right. So let me just move a little along. So one of the things I want to mention about infrastructure, which is extremely important, is the importance of pricing. Okay, today, the absence of carbon pricing is a major distortion in the choice around infrastructure, because infrastructure is fundamentally a long-term investment decision. And the fact that investors do not internalize the footprint that they have on this planet is a major distortion. So it's extremely important for multilateral development banks and for governments to, in some sense, internalize that. They need to ask, would this project be viable if carbon prices were at $50 a ton or at $100 a ton? That's an extremely important decision that has to be taken and asked. Similarly, on fossil fuel subsidies, tremendous distortion that exists in terms against of choices, and more generally things like water charges for environmental degradation and the like. So these externalities can only be corrected if either the price or the shadow price is correct. The second is infrastructure is an extremely complex political and economic decision. I often say in building infrastructure, we are building for the next generation, but the decisions around infrastructure are typically taken by the short-term political cycle. So if you get the Philippines and the government is enlightened, you might get a good decision. But we know whether it is the United States or whether it is in many other jurisdictions, many of the decisions around infrastructure are taken by sitting governments and sitting short-term political cycles. Just like monetary policy was cured by independent central banking, We need institutional innovations around infrastructure that take the decision making out of short-term political cycle and make it truly long-term. Many of the things that we heard from Secretary Villar were in that direction. What are they? First and foremost, you need a long-term vision and you need a long-term plan, because infrastructure is about networked investments. It's not about one investment at a time, it's a networked investment decision, and you need to be able to have a clear plan around which you can signal your intent over a long haul. And the kind of pictures that we saw from the Philippines is the way to do it, and they need to be backed up by solid evidence-based analysis about benefits and to the taxpayers of the country. Second, you need to be able to translate those into priorities. The IMF has a methodology which it uses called the Public Investment Management Assessment Framework, and most countries don't measure up to it. So prioritization is the next thing. We need standards of procurement, including sustainable procurement and green procurement. We need to be able to have good PPP frameworks. All of these are in stages of progress, but getting it all right is a very difficult task. And lest I seem to be preaching that this is all about developing countries, let me just give an example. In the city where I live, Washington, D.C., we had perhaps the state-of-the-art metro system which was introduced in the late 70s. Today it is basically bankrupt because it has not been looked after in the kind of ways that needed to be. It doesn't have an investment program. The grid structure of that metro remains primitive. It has taken us 20 years to agree on and build one metro line. In China, they are building 360 systems at the same time. So getting this right is not easy even in advanced countries, and therefore the decision making around this is one of the complexity, which takes me to the next slide, which is the central and overarching importance of governance. And when I talk about governance, I mean the political economy about governance, I mean the institutions about governance, and yes, I mean corruption. Addressing that is absolutely central in the infrastructure field, and there is a lot that is happening, but there is a lot that is not happening, and the gap between theory and practice is still great. Now, the other part of it is how do we do two things? How do we ensure that we can go from one project at a time to a whole suite of projects? And how can we ensure that every project is as sustainable as it can be? So the reason I put this up is this is an initiative that was launched by the Asian Development Bank. The Philippines, I know, is very actively involved in this, and this is a platform. And I want to preach the virtues of a platform because it is the only way in which you can get better data, you can get better benchmarks, and you can create a partnership between the public and private sector based on transparency, good information, and monitoring the results as it happens. And this platform source, I hope, will be one such transformative platform that we could work on. And I won't go through this, but there is good work underway right now on developing, in some sense, what I would call principles, high-level principles, guidance tools, and indeed standards for sustainable infrastructure. In a separate paper, we have actually evaluated all of these, and we see that there are commonalities, but there are also differences. Since I'm here in Japan, let me focus particularly on a term which Japan introduced as part of its G7 chairmanship, what's called quality infrastructure associated with the G7 Aishima principles. Very positive contribution. It is very similar, but not exactly the same as sustainable infrastructure, which is what has been worked on for a while. And I think Both of these have merits. So these days I say quality and sustainable infrastructure. But this discussion is going to be very important again if we want not just to get the quantum of investment right, but we also want to get the quality right. So let me close with the financing challenge. And I want to begin with the central contribution of the book. And the central contribution of the book is drawing the distinction between infrastructure funding and infrastructure financing. And what do we mean by that? If you think about infrastructure, its characteristics are you make a large investment, and indeed you make a lot of investment even before the project starts, and you have very high capital costs, and then the project pays back over a very long period of time. Okay? So there is no way, first and foremost, that this project is realizable without the role of finance, because it's finance that does the intertemporal feasibility of this project, because where's the money going to come from? It's going to have to come by taking this over the very long term. But matching those assets and liabilities is complicated by several things that the book points out. The first is user charges are very rarely, particularly in things like transport and beneficial improvements with urban infrastructure, they are very unlikely to meet the total revenue requirements for the project. So making that whole means that the government has to find a way to close what we call the viability gap, the return to the private sector from user charges, and a return that is reasonable for the private sector to make an investment. And what the book does, and the annex does also, is point to very practical ways in which this gap can be closed. And that's one of the seminal contributions of this book that doesn't feature very honestly in a lot of the discussions that happen in the world stage on financing. Everybody immediately runs to finance, and how are we going to mobilize the 100 trillion of finance for infrastructure? But before you can do that, you have to deal with the funding risk rather than the financing risk. Now, the other point that the ADB has pointed out, and this, our work also shows, is that to make investments sustainable and resilient to climate doesn't cost all that much money. Indeed, think about it like this. If you invested in an infrastructure project and you didn't do it in a sustainable and climate resilient way, the likelihood today is that infrastructure asset won't live out its life. So in some sense, it's a false comparison to think that climate and resilience adds to costs. Ultimately, the benefits of doing it right get paid, but get paid down the line. And I'll give you a simple example from our own personal lives. If you had to buy a washing machine, you can buy the best washing machine in the world, a Miele machine, which gives you the lowest cost per unit, the most energy savings, but it costs $2,000. And you can buy a washing machine for $300, which doesn't have those properties, costs more, uses a lot more energy. Most of us will buy the $300 machine. And countries are the same. They will tend to not invest in the most sustainable infrastructure because ultimately, even for countries, the real discount rates tend to be quite high. So, but the reality is sound investments made well don't need to cost that much more. There's a lot of work underway on financing. I'm going to skip it. I just want to focus a little bit on the private financing side, because we say, how do we get private financing to come to the fore? And there are some fundamental, the impediments that are observed on private financing, as this book points out, is ultimately, we do not have clarity on the revenue, and we have uncertainty around those revenue streams or policy-induced risks. And that's the fundamental constraint on private financing. Second, high transactions costs, government regulations, uncertainty about regulations, land procurement, this, that. And on the financing side, we don't have proven financing structures that can be repeated over and over again to produce, in some sense, a virtuous cycle of finance. Underpinning that on the left side are some fundamental constraints that really relate to the nature of capital markets, to the nature of the business environment, to the nature of government-induced policy risks. But there are targeted solutions that can address those risks that we are working on right now, that we think can be brought into bear, and that can in some sense produce results on an accelerated basis rather than just fixing all the fundamentals. And these discussions are underway now, in the G20 included. So this year, the Argentine presidency has put as its number one priority infrastructure financing, and within that, how to create infrastructure as an asset class. And so what they have set out here is essentially a great emphasis on standardization, on risk mitigation, on platforms, on data and benchmarks. All of these are good, but none of them will work unless what's in the book is actually acted on. So in my view, the insights of the book are actually the precursors of this, and it's very, very important to continue to emphasize in the discussions like the G20 the messages of this book. In closing, I just want to say that the multilateral development banks are absolutely critical part of the scaling up story. They perform a role through that entire chain, and we heard that from Secretary Villar. But my argument is today they are performing at a level that is just too small to make a difference at the scale that we need. They will have to be greatly ratcheted up in all of the functions that they are doing. The upstream policy and institutional function, not so much the financing function, but the risk mitigation function. If they do the risk mitigation, then you can bring down the private sector financing so that, risks, so that it becomes investment grade. And then they can take care particularly of the early stage risks, and they can ensure, therefore, that long-term institutional investors come in. And they do need to do it not one institution at a time, but increasingly through platforms. So let me end with that. I think infrastructure is the biggest challenge we face in a policy sense, but it is also the greatest potential for a new public-private partnership. And this book that we have today makes a very, very significant contribution. And I really want to thank the team led by Dr. Yoshino. Thank you very much.